Tonight, we're really happy to hear that, and I'm very proud and honored to be welcoming my friend and my intellectual sister, Audra Simpson, who comes to us from Columbia University in New York City, and in the Department of Anthropology, and before that was at Cornell University in the Department of Anthropology, trained at McGill University in anthropology, and at Concordia University in anthropology as well. And I'm kind of listing everything that I know about her academically because I refuse to read her bio. And if you want to know her publication record, just Google her. She's extensively published, extensively traveled. She's one of the leading Indigenous intellectuals and has really established herself as a presence in not only anthropology, but in many other areas, including governance, which is why we wanted her here, to talk about her ideas about Gagnawage political identity and politics, and then to talk to you all about how you can rethink what it is to be Indigenous through the example of the Gagnawage Mohawk. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend Audra.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming here. And I want to extend my first, actually should be my first thanks to the Coast Salish peoples for their extended hospitality through the years. I'd also like to thank, of course, IGOV, my dear friend, Dr. Tayaga Alfred from home, who is my dear friend, was my mentor, is still my mentor, and was once my professor. He wrote the first book on our community, with our community, and it inspired me in the best ways to write another. So in many ways, my work is a continuation of what he started with his first book. This is, I'm sharing with you the first chapter of my book, Mohawk Interruptus, which you're allowed to laugh at. You're supposed to. And as I said to the very patient and engaging and smart and interesting graduate seminar that I participated in yesterday, this in fact is not a play on Nancy Fraser's book, Justice Interruptus. This is me playing with Coitus Interruptus because I have sex on my brain. And I will be very open about that. But you'll also see that it dials into an argument about interruptions and refusals. I will now start my book. And I start with two quotes, one which is especially temporal and apropos. And I quote, "Unless you are one of the first Americans, a Native American, we are all descended from folks who came from somewhere else. The story of immigrants in America isn't a story of them. It's a story of us. Just as we remain a nation of laws, we have to remain a nation of immigrants." And this was the now re-elected US President Barack Obama on July 4th, 2012, a date of great significance to Americans. My second quote is, "We are representing a nation, and we are not going to travel on the passport of a competitor." Those words were uttered by Tanya Ganella Frickner, the Iroquois Nationals lacrosse team spokesperson and key negotiator during the World Lacrosse Championships on July 19th, 2010. And here I start my chapter with a question. What does it mean to refuse what some consider to be gifts? Rights that express personal and individual freedoms, the right of mobility, of residency, and of love. What does it mean to say no to these things, or to wait until your terms have been met for an agreement, for a reversal of recognition, or conferral of rights? What happens when we refuse what presumably all sensible people perceive to be good things? What does this refusal do to politics, to sense, and to reason? When we add Indigenous peoples to these questions, the assumptions and the histories that structure what is perceived to be good shift and stand in stark relief. The positions assumed by people who refuse gifts may seem reasoned, sensible, and I would argue, deeply correct. And it is in that relief that we see, in fact, that a good is not a good for everyone. The Mohawks of Gagnawage are nationals of a pre-contact indigenous political order that simply refuse to stop being themselves. In other words, they insist on being and acting as peoples who belong to a nation other than the United States, other than Canada. Their political form predates and survives conquest. It is tangible, albeit strangulated by colonial governmentality, and it is tied to sovereign practices. This architecture, this expressive political architecture, is not fanciful, it's not contrived. It is in place because the Mohawks of Gagnawage share a genealogical kinship relationship with other indigenous peoples in North America, and they know this. They refuse to let go of this knowledge. In fact, they enact this knowledge through marriage practices, political engagements, and the way that they live their lives. Their genealogical and political connectedness is part of a covenant, the decision-making Iroquois Confederacy, understood as Haudenosaunee, which is made up of clans that spread across territory. As indigenous peoples, they have survived a great transformative process of settler occupation, and they continue to live under the conditions of this occupation, its disavowal, and its ongoing life, which has required and still requires that they give up their lands and give up themselves. Like many other Haudenosaunee people, the Mohawks of Gagnawage refuse to be Canadian or American. They refuse the gifts of American and Canadian citizenship. They insist upon the integrity of Haudenosaunee governance, and some in my study answer only to that governmental authority. So the bestowal of citizenship, of rights, and identification by the state, and the subsequent subjectivity offered by colonial citizenship has been received with a certain awkwardness, if not outright refusal. A refusal to be conscripted, to vote, to pay taxes, to stop politically being Iroquois. The language that this book uses to tell the story of refusal is the language of the people that I worked with used to talk about themselves. They speak in terms of nationhood, which stages a fundamental difficulty, given that indigenous and nation are two terms that seem incommensurable. Indigenous is embedded conceptually in a geographic and temporal alterity, a radical past, as the other in the history of the West. Although seemingly unable then to be both things at once, the Mohawks of Gagnawage strive to articulate these modalities as they live and move within a territorial space that is overlaid with settler regimes. Nation states, provinces, federal states, borders between these nation states, and their laws that regulate or circumscribe their way of life. When I started my work formally in 1996, much of the political energy in this community was focused on, quote, the question of membership, the problem of membership. By this I mean, and this is I know this is no news to you, but the criteria for political membership and formal recognition within their community, as well as the need, in this case, as articulated by this community, the need and the desire to come up with a formal code to define political rights of belonging that are independent from the Canadian state. This, as you may know, is a reservation in American terms, or reserve community, comprised of approximately 65 people in residence and 8,000 on a larger list. Membership was then, in 1996, and still is, considered deeply fundamental. It affords some the rights that matter: to live on the reserve, to vote if you want in band council or tribal elections, to be buried on the reserve. Yet colonization has made this an issue, a divisive, lacerating issue within the community. The terms of this deeply fundamental question are underscored by existential ones. Who are we? Who shall we be for the future? Who belongs here, and why do they belong here? It is partially because of their winnowed land base and the legally imposed constraint to determining membership according to their own political traditions that the discussion of membership, the formation of the code, was and still is something that nearly every community member agrees to disagree over. Conversations are weighted by previous and still occurring miscarriages of justice, misrecognitions, animosities, and the list goes on. Here, summarized, recalled, taken from notes, overheard, engaged in, processed, flipped back to, are different moments from research, different moments abstracted from my own life as a member of this community, fragments that are taken from careening and breakneck moments of conversation. And here I quote and I remember, I know someone who's listed as 48%, and the sister's 100%. They have the same parents. What the hell happened there? I have no idea. How can you be 48% Indian? Why are we not going through the women? We should go through the women. How is she on the list when she is white? They were taken off the list because they're white. Who the hell is that? I don't know him, he's not from here. I never heard of that person. That man is full of shit. These are direct quotes. My kinsman is laughing. I don't know him. Who is your mother? I saw your mother yesterday. Direct, pointed, fast. Who are you? There is always an answer with genealogic authority. I am to you this way. This is my family, this is my mother, this is my father. Thus, I am known to you this way. And it's sorted out. This genealogic is sorted out in these breakneck, fast, summarizing, and deeply important moments between people. The subtext seems to be, I want to know who you are. Tell me who you are. I will know who you are if you or someone else can tell me who you are. The authority rests in knowledge of another's family, living families, whether they are entirely from the community or not. I know who you are, point final. We are done, we can proceed. If you require more explanation or cannot explain yourself or be explained or claimed by others, then there's a problem. Membership talk such as this conditions such people as problems, the unknowable, the illegitimate, and also determines the conditions of belonging, the legitimacy of legal personhood outside of official law or state law. Here the axis is in memory, in conversation, in sociality. By talking to other people, you understand who someone is, how they are connected and socially, effectively legitimized, with or without official recognition. But this knowledge archive is structured through prior languages and experiences of exclusion and inclusion that are tethered, sometimes with venom, to historical processes. From our movement from what is now New York State into the northern hunting territory that became Gagnawage, what is now southwestern Quebec or Canada, this occurred in the 17th century and moved Mohawks territorially into the first Catholic mission in the Northeast, an emergent reservation, the oldest in the Northeast, and into new sites of permanence and ongoing mobility. The Indian Act of 1876, the overarching, quote, law of Indians in Canada, as well as other laws or practices that we will see legally made and unmade Indians and their rights in a Western, specifically Victorian model of heteronormative patrilineal descent and rule that attempted to order their winnowed territories. This vied with the ongoing life of Iroquois tradition. The Indian Act signals, and some would argue is, foreign authority and government. It's Canada, and with it comes electorally based governance. The governmental form tradition that the Code and the Band Council initially papered over is simultaneously vital, an ongoing philosophical system and governmental structure. But this governmental structure lives in the present and does not belong in the pre-modern static past. Tradition is fundamentally contemporary. Tradition has been externalized and made into a good, an object, a self-conscious practice that people must do in light of the legal forces of assimilation. It thus signals the things then that are supposed to have been done before white people came here and are still done today. These seemingly antagonistic processes of tradition, modernity, and settlement are what made and still make forming an agreed upon membership code in Gagnawage deeply challenging, vexed, and biting. They open the problem of membership into much larger historical and political processes and questions, such as the context for rights, their meanings on the ground, and how to be a nation if much of one's territory has been taken, if the rights to determine the terms of legal belonging, a crucial component of sovereignty, has been dictated by a foreign government, if the knowledge of this is opaque or hidden, and you are viewed not as a people with a governmental system, a philosophical order, but as a remnant, as a, quote, culture, a minority within an ethno-cultural mosaic of differences that speak not of sovereignty, but of settler manageability. Nationhood, one might think, hangs in the brink. But this story that I'm telling starts with a grounded refusal, not a precipice. In this book, I make 3 claims that are drawn from ethnographic research with my own people. First, sovereignty may exist within sovereignty. One does not negate the other entirely, but they necessarily stand in terrific tension and pose serious jurisdictional and normative challenges to each other. Whose citizen are you? What authority do you answer to or not answer to, challenging the very legitimacy of the other? If a Haudenosaunee person is to travel, for example, internationally on a Confederacy passport, then the very boundaries and the very lawfulness of the original territorial referent is called into question. All of the US, all of Canada then may be international, which in fact, some might argue it was prior to contact and actually still is. Like Indigenous bodies, Indigenous sovereignties, and Indigenous political orders prevail within and apart from settler governance. And this form of nested sovereignty has implications for the sturdiness of nation states overall, but especially for formulations of political membership as articulated and fought over within these nested sovereignties. Second, there is a political alternative to recognition, the much sought after and presumed good of multicultural politics. This alternative is refusal, and it is exercised by people within my book and people as we think and speak in this moment in Gagnawage right now. It is deployed here as a political and ethical stance that stands in stark contrast to the desire to have one's distinctiveness as a culture recognized. Refusal comes with the requirement of having one's political sovereignty and nationhood acknowledged and upheld, and raises the question of legitimacy for those who are usually in the position of recognizing. What is their authority to do so? Where does it come from? Who are they to do so? Refusal also becomes a mode for me, and I don't know if there are other anthropologists here, but it becomes a mode of ethnographic writing, where one explicitly exercises sovereignty or dominion over text. This is tied inextricably to my final claim. Finally is the claim that the way in which we have come to know the politics and cultures of indigenous peoples requires an accounting that neither anthropology nor political science has done very well. Except, of course, your first book. I don't know. I teach it. I don't know. I'm doing my part. One field of inquiry, anthropology, has dealt almost exclusively with indigenous peoples in an ahistorical and depoliticized sense. Political science, government, and political theory are relatively new to questions of indigenous political life and deal with this life as a case that is wholly documentary or an ethical test to Western norms of acknowledgement. Because of their Western institutional and statist focus, none of these disciplines have dealt even-handedly, I would say robustly or critically, with indigenous politics and how these politics challenge what most perceive to be settled. By settled, I mean done, I mean finished, complete, the presumed endgame of the colonial project, a project that initiates the clean slate of settlement. This sense of things being settled, of newness, of a nation of immigrants, with an exception accorded to Indians, is in part due to a blindness to the structure of settler colonial nation statehood, its labor, its pain, and its agonies, which are ongoing and get glossed and celebrated, as we saw in the opening quote from the recently re-elected President Barack Obama. These three claims force us to an argument, I think, about political form, positioning, and strategy. Rooted in the Iroquois case broadly and Gagnawage specifically, we see that under the conditions of settler colonialism, a particular form of colonialism which requires indigenous territory and thus indigenous elimination, multiple sovereignties cannot proliferate robustly or equally. One proliferates, as I said earlier, at the other's expense. And in short form, the US and Canada can only come into political being because of indigenous dispossession, right? This is a condition of its possibility. Under these conditions, there cannot be two perfectly equal, robust sovereignties, for built into sovereignty, a deeply problematic, imperfect political form, if ever there was one, for built into sovereignty is a jurisdictional dominion over territory, a notion of singular law and singular authority. Of course, as we all know here, manifest in the notion of a king, a state, the band council, the tribal council, even this form that circulates in our territories, the notion of the people. Under the conditions of settler colonialism in North America, which is an ongoing and structural project to acquire land, to maintain that land, and to eliminate who is on it, there has been a great violence, dispossession, and thankfully there has been failure. It did not completely work. There are still Indians. Some still know this, some will defend what they have left, and will persist robustly. In this failure, there has been, and we can infer will continue to be, pushback on these logics of elimination. This failure to kill, to disappear entirely, is indigenous life in the face of what was to be bodily and structural death. With that bodily life, there is an awareness and a consciousness of this history, of life within this history, and principles of political vitality that are moved forward. Again, this gets called tradition, is often conflated, especially in the States, with sovereignty. Those who still live this struggle of different political authorities find it manifested in its nested form, in the continuity of a language and an experience of nationhood. Yet this settler state still enfolds them. their land, their practices, and does so territorially and jurisdictionally. This then makes, in this ethnographic case, for the politics of ongoing refusal, to refuse that situation, to highlight its history, its contradictions. Ethnography in such settings requires an historical and ethnologic accounting of why politics takes this form. How is it that Indigenous peoples have come to be known in particular ways? Their politics known in particular ways. These are politics that narrow to a point of irrational, unexplainable, seemingly illiberal exclusion and expulsion, the problem of membership. And I'll flag that problem or summarize it with a signpost. On February 1st, 2010, 26 non-natives cohabitating with residents and members of Gagnawage were issued eviction notices, you may have heard. We're like the illiberal poster boys and girls of Canada. That was a joke, and it was funny, and you can laugh. It's like the Interruptus. It's funny. I know it's funny. The Council of Elected Officials that is authorized by the Indian Act and thus Canada to govern the community. They were told that they must leave the territory because as non-Indians residing in Gagnawage without any form of recognition from the Band Council, they were living in contravention to the Gagnawage membership law. Now, how was this action authorized? Consider here the first few paragraphs of the preamble to the revised membership law. We are the Gagnawage of Gagnawage. We are a community within the Gagnawage Nation and the Haudenosaunee, and as such, we are Indigenous peoples who possess a fundamental and inherent right of self-determination given to us by the Creator. As Indigenous peoples, we have the right to maintain and promote our identity, including our culture, our traditions, our language, laws, and customs. As Indigenous peoples, we have the collective right to determine our membership. This right is fundamental to our survival. And further, we recognize that we have been harmed by foreign governments' attempts to undermine our will and ability to survive by dividing our community. We reject the imposition of the Indian Act and other foreign laws that have presumed to define the principles upon which the membership of our community will be determined. We reject all efforts to assimilate and extinguish our community under the guise of absolute individualism. Take that, liberals. That was joke number 3. Here we can see that this technique of governance is articulating a fear of disappearance through the very means that would disappear this nation, Canadian authorized governance. This is represented in the values of individual rights over collective rights, the ahistorical and presumed even-handedness of liberalism as a social and political framework for determining and rendering justice, in part through presumed shared values of freedom, justice, equality, individualism, even distribution, and free trade, values that even the architects of this reservation constitution designate as intrusive and forcible. Why would the architects of a law that receives its authority from the government that they signal as foreign say such a thing? What is it from their political ethos and history that would make for such a paradoxical position of asserting authority away from the authority that bestows it? I think this is a fantastic colonial conundrum. While pointing to its fundamental, at the same time pointing to its fundamental illegitimacy, right? Take that, Fanon. Who are these people? Consider this in a descriptive register of boring anthropology. That's not in the book. This is a reserve. This is a reserve community of indigenous nationals that belong to a larger pre-contact political confederacy in what is now understood to be northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. They are known to themselves as Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse, in reference to their traditional living arrangement of clan-based houses and governing structure. This political confederacy is what is known in anthropological and everyday understanding as the Iroquois Confederacy. As a polity, the Mohawks of Gagnawage are comprised of turtle, wolf, and bear clans determined through matrilineal descent lines. They also have a membership within a political corpus of the larger longhouse and families and responsibilities, which spreads metaphorically across Iroquois. This is what they will not let go of, or forget, or cease to enact: their relatedness to others, to a particular history, to their ongoing experiences because of this relatedness. In a nutshell, this is what they appear to be when they appear. These kin and reciprocal relationships extend through the 15 other Iroquois reservations on either side of the border, as well as the cities, suburbs, and non-reserve rural areas that Iroquois people move through and dwell within. Because of these spatial arrangements and spatial connections through Iroquois, and we will find, as per settler colonialism's requirement, these people also have many severed connections. This book is an argument regarding the assertion of their complicated life, their political life and history in the face of a settler denial of that life, the circumscription of that life, and then the disavowal of wrongdoing. These processes of force, circumscription, disavowal stage the fundamentally interrupted and interruptive capacity of indigenous political life broadly. What does it mean to want to be seen as you feel you should be seen under conditions that fundamentally disavow the historical wrongdoing that constitutes you not as a nation, but as a problem? That problem being simply surviving against elimination, right? That's the Indian problem. We lived. This survival presents itself in the eyes of settler states as illiberal anomaly or cultural deviance, and I have a whole chapter to the anthropologists on this. Cultural deviance and pathology. What then, under these conditions, is the struggle? As we saw through the membership talk, the surprise of indigenous survival is articulated through an archive of knowledge, identification, and beliefs about what is right, what should be done. Its design and its execution both portends much for the present and for the future. Who should be here? How should we do this? Is this fair? These are questions that instill an ongoing preoccupation, a set of normative questions that find no easy juridical answers. And yet, membership is simultaneously so simply explained as this is how I am to you. It's not even who I am to you, it's how I am to you. Along with the ideas of indigenous and nation, I use the Hegelian term recognition and its inverse. Where's Jim Tully? I have Hegel here. I'm kind of glad he's not here, though. Embarrass myself. And here's person 3000 reading Hegel, anyway. I use the Hegelian term recognition and its inverse misrecognition to tell this story. No matter how deeply, and this is because no matter how deeply Gagnawage and other indigenous nations and nationals understand themselves to be of their own philosophical and political systems, and no matter how deeply they understand the scene of their objectification as Indians, or even more ghastly, as minoritized peoples, they are rarely seen or then treated in the settler eye as that which they are and wish to be recognized as: nationals with sovereign authority over their lives, over their membership, and living within their own territories. Their territories, which, as we know, have been held for them in the form of reservations. And I have a second signpost to deepen the marking of the space that we walk through in the introduction. And this signpost is called detention. On April 28, 2010, 3 Mohawks of Gagnawage were detained in El Salvador for 17 days. They were flying back to Canada from the International Climate Change Conference in Bolivia and were traveling on Haudenosaunee passports. They refused to allow Canada to issue them, quote, emergency travel documents, which amount to a passport. They waited instead for 10 more days, and they were finally permitted re-entry into Canada via their Iroquois Confederacy passports. The event of this detention is not an anomaly. Like the evictions in Signpost 1, this event is part of something larger, a set of assertions by Haudenosaunee peoples through time. They make these assertions based on the validity and vitality of their own philosophical and governmental systems, systems that predate the settler state. Their arguments and actions regarding these systems and the systems themselves move discursively and materially into the face of the settler logic of dispossession, occupation, and elimination. It is the same logic that informs Ganawage's reservation-based preoccupations and assertions regarding membership. Membership, passports, and evictions are of a piece with each other, as they all speak of a fear of elimination, but also speak from a form of sovereign authority. I know you, I know who I am, this is what I speak from. This treaty, this genealogic, this archive. I refuse until you get it, or until I think you got it, or simply, I just refuse. In order to best give refusal as a political strategy its legs, it is helpful to turn directly to settler colonialism and to the work of Patrick Wolfe to contextualize the force that Gagnawage are up against. As mentioned earlier, he argues that settler colonialism is defined by a territorial project. This is a project for land, but that seemingly singular focus differentiates it from other forms of colonialism. While the settler variety is acquisitive, unlike other colonialisms, it is not labor, but it's territory that it seeks. Because Indigenous peoples are tied to the desired territories as caretakers, as property owners, they must be eliminated. Because in the settler colonial model, remember, the settler never leaves. Their need for a permanent place to settle propels the aforementioned process that Wolfe calls starkly and without nuance, simply elimination. The desire for land produces then that problem, the Indian problem, the problem of Indigenous life that is already living on that land. How then to manage the Indian problem, as it is known in American and Canadian administrative speak? Like the Jewish problem posed by Jewish life and alterity, and now the Palestinian problem posed by, quote, overlapping claims to their territory, the Indian problem is one of the coexistence or the existence of continued life of any form in the face of an acquisitional and territorial desire that then moves through time to become, in liberal parlance, and we heard a lot of this in the 90s, the problem of difference, cultural difference. In the case of indigeneity in North America, this has become an applied question, but it's an applied question that has a life through time. Initially it was, what do we do with their souls, right? What do we do with their bodies? What do we do with their culture? Now what do we do with their difference, which is upon the land that I want and that I need? Now the answer to these questions appears to be for settler states to apologize or to recognize Indigenous peoples and historical wrongdoings that obtain to them. These are the gentler forms, or this is the gentler form perhaps, or the least corporeally violent form of managing them and their difference, a multicultural solution to the Indians' problem, the problem of settlers. Here we have settler desire and acquisitiveness and the ideologies, laws, and practices that tend to their hunger for Indian land and life. the settler imperative is to eliminate them and live upon, if not own, outright their land. This desire and attendant practices gets rerouted or displaced in liberal argumentation through the trick of toleration, of recognition, the performance post-conquest of, quote, seeing people as they ought to be seen, as they see themselves, an impossible and also tricky beneficence that actually may extend forms of settlement through the language and practices of, at times, nearly impossible but seemingly democratic inclusion. This inclusion or juridical form of recognition is performed, however, only if the problem of cultural difference and alterity does not pose too appalling a challenge to the norms of settler society, norms which are revealed largely through law in the form of decisions over the sturdiness, vitality, and purity of the cultural alterity before it. This fixation upon cultural difference and its purity occludes the sovereignty that is before it and the nationhood that is before it. Political recognition is a technique of settler governance, but appears as a transcendent and universal human desire that becomes a political antidote to historical wrongdoing, and so would seem to salve the wounds of settler colonialism. Charles Taylor offers a foundational and empirically driven moral formulation and defense of recognition for those whose difference is of such culturally determined form that they cannot help but be different, and so must be recognized as having traditions that should be more than just tolerated, he argues. The question of whether they should tolerate being tolerated in such a manner does not arise for Taylor or others on his tail. However, recognition is a moral imperative, as Taylor argues, because to be without recognition will cause harm. And harm is in itself intolerable. In this context, then, people are thus not only deserving of recognition, but this is, he argues quite simply, a vital human need. Gagnawage Mohawks are caught up in the history of wrongdoing and disavowal that Taylor's concerns speak from. This is an historical attitude that supplants the ravages of settler colonialism with those definitions of difference. Tolerance, recognition, and the specific technique that is multicultural policy are but an elaboration of an older sequence of attitudes towards the problem of difference on acquired and some might argue simply seized territories. I am here talking about a latter-day move to techniques that are used to manage the problem of indigenous people, here defined or translated as the politically recognized nations that are reservationized, and in this move categorically to become populations instead of nations, and as populations, people to be administered by the state. This moves indigenous peoples and their polities into the settler imaginary, from nations to people to categories that become, in fact, racialized, that have shifted through time and are shifts that relate to land and its dispossession from them. More importantly for this discussion, these categorical shifts set indigenous peoples up for governmental regulation, intrusion. So these political techniques of occupying, treating, forceful elimination, containment, assimilation, the coterminous logics and practices and languages of race and civilization, the practice of immigration rather than settlement, the legal notion of a natal right and presumption of just occupancy all form the fulcrum of settlement's labor and its imaginary, as well as a whole host of other self-authorizing techniques and frameworks that sustain the ongoing dispossession and occupation of Indian land. It is in this imagined space of just settlement, settler nationhood, and statehood that the Iroquois assert the benchmarks of Western territorially based sovereignty discussed above. Regulations over membership and jurisdictional authority over rights to residency, the issuing of Confederacy passports, the insistence upon the validity of their politics according to prior agreements, prior recognitions, and insistence upon recognition and honorable relations now between nations. In these examples, we see prior recognition born from the political status of nationhood and an ongoing and unvanquished sovereignty. To assert this is to fundamentally interrupt the sovereignty and the monocultural aspirations of nation states, but especially those that are rooted in indigenous dispossession. It is in the assertion of these rights, which are being diminished and narrowly interpreted, if not completely abrogated in the American courts, that Iroquois people remind nation states such as the US and Canada that they possess this very history. And within that history, and within this seas space, they possess a precarious assumption that their boundaries are permanent, uncontestable, and entrenched. They possess a precarious assumption about their own origins. And by extension, they possess a precarious assumption about themselves. The settler precariousness that I speak of structures as well this story that I'm telling of Mohawk life, the labor of principle and sovereignty, labor that begins with a refusal. That refusal is simply to disappear. A refusal to be on the other end of Patrick Wolf's critical comparative history, a refusal to be eliminated. In refusing to go away, to cease to be, in asserting something beyond difference, requires that one coexist or live tacitly in a settled state. In this, to accept the dispossession of your lands, to internalize and believe the things that have been taught to you about you, that you are a savage, that your language is incoherent, that you are less than white people, not quite up to par, that you are then different, and that with a different culture that is defined actually not by you but by others, and will be accorded a protected legal space of legal recognition if your group evidences that difference in terms that suffice to the settler's legal eye. To accept this is an impossible project for some indigenous people, right? And not because it is impossible to achieve, that's bracketing that issue, but politically untenable, and thus normatively should be refused. Contorting oneself in a fundamental space of misrecognition is not just about subject formation, it's about historical formation. And in this refusal to agree to these terms and to be eliminated, there is an assertion of actual histories, and thus to legislate interpretive possibilities in contestation. Interpretations of treaty, possibilities of movement, electoral practices. This isn't only about individual cells. But I have to tell you, it was in the course of at the level of the individual cells that these questions became deeply real to me. The problem of history, of its effects, the stuff that I've just been talking about in fairly abstract terms, the ways in which people may or may not have been disappeared, right? This became very real to me when someone appeared to me in a particular form in the space of an interview. And here I'll share with you that interview. This is a long time ago in Brooklyn during my formal field work. I was talking to this older man. My father's father had to be from Gagnawage, he said to me. That is the dialect of Mohawk that he spoke. Oh yeah, I say, agreeably, smilingly, who's your father? He tells me his father's name, and then he tells me even his grandfather's name. I have no idea who they are. I ask him to explain them to me. Who are they related to? He cannot tell me this. He cannot seem to tell me this. I say, how is he from Gagnawage? And he says to me, he can't be from Gagnawage. This is my great-grandfather. So this is really puzzling for me. You have to know this was really puzzling for me in this interview. And I'm pretty sure that I'm not hiding it well. This person has been identified in a book as being from the community. I track him down. This is how I find him. I ask people, have you ever heard this name? This man's last name, a generic sounding English name. And they've never heard of this name. This is odd, but his membership or his belongingness is still within the realm of the possible. Maybe it's his grandmother that's from Gagnawage and she married out and she got a different last name. Maybe his mother married out too, and that's how he has this name that nobody knows. So I look forward to interviewing him. We've emailed for a year prior to the interview and he consents to be interviewed. Talking with him seems especially promising since he's identified in the book that I read as someone who was involved in cultural revival in the 70s. Yet the answers he's giving me simply are not right. Okay, I don't know how else to put it. They're not right. They make it impossible for me to place him, right? None of the usual questions of family or place yield an answer that would situate him in the social, historical, or cartographic universe of the community other than as a friend or a guest. The most critical question, the question of family, the surefire means of placing someone within the tendrils of membership, keeps slipping away from this conversation. I cannot grab on to what he is saying. He seems so thoroughly anchored in Brooklyn and the 70s that I can't get a handle on him as a Gagnawage Nationhood, and that's a huge oxymoron in itself. Did I make a mistake with this one? So I say to him, then how is he from Gagnawage? Don't forget, Audra, I'm in my late 60s. We're talking about someone who fought in the Civil War. He was from the original Gagnawage, the one in upstate New York. Oh, I realize we're not even in the 1970s. This is the wrong century even. And that settles it for me. I realize that these questions are useless, that I have to cool it. This is confusing, but perhaps is productive. Once I let go of the compasses that guide most of these interviews, we spend the next 2 hours talking about people from Gagnawage in the early 70s. We talk about where they lived, what they're up to. When they moved back up from Brooklyn, we talk about the first longhouse. We talk about Gagnawage, the pot-bellied stove that he drove from Gagnawage to Plattsburgh to buy. We talk about Handsome Lake. He wonders if the pot-bellied stove is still in the longhouse, and I wondered too. Voices such as these, as this one, that interviews, etc., within the book, the other chapters in the book, evidence the concern over the loss of territory and the loss of jurisdictional authority that motivate much of the membership debate. And much of this anxiety, as you now know, of course, stems from events of the past, of the historical injustice that Gagnawage Nationhood have experienced as they watch their seigneurial land grant get smaller and smaller, as they engage the state in opposition to the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway. But these anxieties in politics also speak from the ethical and methodological problem of this history, right? This complicated history, as it aligns or misaligns to issues and questions of recognition. How does one recognize that? Or how does one recognize someone who speaks from this, as this interlocutor did, this man in Brooklyn, who speaks from this complicated past? The interlocutor, this person speaks from this past, but he's also of this past and remains to me so many years later an indecipherable cipher of this complicated history. Others might say, he's just not of the place that is being examined. He is of temporality, of a past place. He simply cannot be known in a genealogical way by people who now sort these things out. Can you claim an identity or a membership within a political grouping if it does not claim you? I mean, ethically, can you do this, right? This, not to mention empirically, this seems a thin composition of a much deeper question and is often the way in which these questions get constructed in debates over Indigenous identity these days. Identity actually gets conflated with one's sense of self, with one's, quote, ancestral recall of things, sometimes based on very strange and dubious evidence, family photos, cheekbones, the fondling of the incisors, without care or commitment to the political reckoning system of the polity in question. My point is not to challenge this person's truth claim, but to point out the ways in which the narrative he provides highlights the very problem of settler colonialism, of fragmentation, of doubt. He did not seem to doubt himself one bit. And that's interesting, as there are people with deeply entrenched genealogical connections to Gagnawage who are under scrutiny, who are debated, and who are disenfranchised. He appears still to be out of the way, anomalous, and was very compelling, but not for these reasons. Now, so many years after my interview with him, I think back to him as I continue to meet people. And this is in the States, and we were talking a little bit about this in the seminar yesterday, but I really deal with this a lot in the States. People who claim Indian identities in similar very abstract, culturalist, behaviorist ways, in ways that are actually not about political recognition or refusal, but individualist self-fashioning. These claims of Indian identity do not rely on those political matrices of reckoning that are alive in communities. The reckoning where people, and here people in the plural, more than one, people know you before you know you. One might think most immediately to the controversy and confusion regarding Harvard law professor and Democratic candidate for US Senate, Elizabeth Warren's claims to Cherokee heritage or descent. And I hope you know about this, or now you will. And here about Harvard's purported use of her to evidence diversity. Did she knowingly allow herself to be identified by them as a minority when she was a junior professor, regardless of what the Cherokee Nation or her family, her extended family, thought of this? Was hers a proper mode of self-designation in light of Cherokee sovereignty and jurisdictional authority over membership? This provided terrific fodder for conservative Republicans to malign her as disingenuous, fake, a false beneficiary of benefits that should accord to the certifiable, or truly minoritized, and in this statistically scarce. Again, this is all unfolding during her campaign for Senate, and to me this all seems very American. Invoking ancestry rather than Indian citizenship or membership, investing centrality in settler citizenship and political identity, and investing political identity in one sovereignty, that of the United States, and then leaving that sovereignty intact through this light recourse to cheekbones, this fetishization of body parts, cheekbones. This serves as a paltry claiming tactic and substitution for indigenous governance systems, charters, philosophical orders, normativities, clans, living people of those places who know who they are and who would not or would know her if given the opportunity to claim her. The Brooklyn interlocutor's mode of self-identification seemed very American and thus vulnerable to a similar sort of scrutiny by me. My point is not to perform such a scrutinizing autopsy on his claim, but to highlight it again as anomalous but also culturalist in its act of claiming. This is the dialect my father spoke, in light of the place that he invokes and then questions that obtain to his claim. Gagnawage and many Gagnawage refuse these modes of self-fashioning. In part, and part of this is because of its status as a place and a people both subjected to and yet distanced from the corpus of various forms of recognition, as a place of ongoing implicit and explicit refusals to even see themselves this way. More specifically, the community is an out-of-the-way place in the context of the territorial history of the Iroquois, and as I demonstrate later in the book, in light of the written, very canonical and anthropologically driven history of the Iroquois. Conceived erroneously as a village of, quote, praying Indians, as travelers, as showmen and women, and now iron workers, Gagnawage has not seized the ethnographic and the political imagination in the way that other indigenous communities have. Communities that appear to be more perfect, more culturally, quote, intact. This is language that's used, such as Six Nations or Tonawanda. Later in the book, I illustrate the ways in which early ethnology and later ethnography contributed to the territorial and cultural bias in order to further construct Gagnawage as an out-of-the-way place, a place of deviance and unknowing, and most specifically a place distanced from Iroquois politics and sovereignty, which they then constructed as a site of impure culture, rather than vigorous political assertion and sovereignty. We are near the end, people. You're very patient. Sorry, I must find where I... Oops, sorry. It's a long book. Gagnawage is unique within the landscape, not only of anthropology, Native and Indigenous studies, and the specificity of Iroquois studies, but also in most political studies. This unique positioning owes to the history, of course, of anthropology, the particular culture base of the community, and the settler history of Canada, which I really highlighted in this reading from the book, all of which contribute to the reading of this community as improperly Iroquois, right? Or impossibly nationalist, since they are indigenous and non-Western. The oversight of Gagnawage in the literature on nationalism, with the exception, of course, of this critical book that Gerald Alford wrote, his first book was just so important, has much to do with the conventional foci of both anthropology and political science, and have both theoretical and methodological reasons for these occlusions. Neither discipline had the conceptual tools to engage the possibility of indigenous nationhood, I'd say within its own terms, nor could they do so in ways that were consistent with the words and actions of their subjects. Neither has seemed to take seriously either the claim that settler colonialism places upon the subjectivities or the politics and the purpose of peoples in these geopolitical spaces. Much of this is changing, however, with recent works, of course, in Native American studies or Native studies and anthropology, some political science. I'm really heartened by Glenn Couthard's work and Rob Nichols' work coming down the pipeline, that are less interested in the salvage paradigm that dominated the anthropology of Native North America. The ongoing attention that has been paid to colonialism as a situation that is always elsewhere rather than here, and as a situation that is always in the before rather than now, has left the politics of the nations within North America largely unexamined and under-theorized. This book will reverse that trend. Thank you. Okay.
I understand myself now.
That's really funny.
So, we have time for questions and comments, and I just asked you to moderate that. So if we have questions, I'll raise your hand. Jessica, start us off.
Are you selling your book here? Oh, you're so kind. I'm not. But it's actually out for review again. So it will hopefully be in print within the next year and a half, hopefully. But it was just sent back to Duke. Duke University Press will be publishing this, and it was just sent out for its second reading by reviewers. So, but I'll happily sell it here. Thank you.
We'll bring it back when it comes out.
Thank you. It's quite flattering. Oh, come on.
Can you say a few words about the irony and sarcasm in your talk and in your book?
Say a few words about it.
Was I the only one here who said irony? Or?
I don't know. I don't think about it much. It's just my MO. I don't really think about it much, but maybe it's just something I do. I think it's a mode of analysis, perhaps. So, do you want to say a little bit more? Do you want to add to your question?
Sometimes it comes from pain, from desire to distance yourself.
Like as a technique of analysis? I don't know. I think I'm more just a funny person. Like I don't know. I'm a funny person. I think that's my only.
Anybody else from Brooklyn?
No, just a funny person. Just a funny person, I think. But also, I mean, this is really irritating material, right? I mean, I think irritation, to say the least, is productive, can be very productive, but I could not, I'm going to take your question where I want to take it. So if you're reading or hearing or sensing irony and sarcasm, I'm actually translating that as sometimes humor, but not always. But I am committed to a form of analysis that highlights moments that perhaps are ironic or these moments of incommensurable moments in some ways, because I am so irritated, to say the least, with the ongoing disavowal of actual history in terms of, like I've had to learn American history to teach it. When I got my first job, I had to teach an Intro to Native Studies class, and I had to learn the Indian Wars, and it just flipped me out. Like I just couldn't believe that 100, and it keeps me very happy and angry that, you know, that this is not talked about, and I say happy carefully. I mean, it is a joyful thing to be alive before certain things, right? To know and to not be dead to it. So it trips me out that that isn't you know, this is not discussed because I think this is part of the key to understanding the U.S., key to understand U.S. foreign policy, but it also, I think, is just such a shared secret that I have to at least make fun of it and make fun of Americans and make fun of Canadians because they think they're all that, and they're actually not that, right? So, and I would like us all to share in the joy of being excited by that knowledge. So, but I think I'm also just generally pretty funny. So I don't, like, it's not that deliberate. I just like to crack up. So, yeah, sure.
I'll just add to that. You know, I think that Audra is exemplifying too, part of an oratorical tradition within our culture and within Indigenous cultures to a certain extent. If you think about it, Iroquois peoples are very, very concerned with two things when they do oratory. One is being right, and the other is being entertaining.
Oh.
And you can't really do one without the other in the Iroquois tradition. And so I think that Audra reflects that, you know, even if you haven't articulated in your response. I mean, I think you've kind of assimilated that in being around it so much.
Yeah.
And being in engagement
Yeah.
in the community.
Yeah.
You just cannot win a political argument in those communities without doing both of those things. And
Perhaps.
so I think that you're bringing out that as well.
Okay, cool. I'm representing.
If I may say so.
Cool.
Aside from you're just hilarious.
Okay.
Jeff and I think that she should do stand-up comedy as her second thing.
You just show me the money. Show me the wampum. Show me those strings.
Off to the left here.
Yeah, you're chairing this.
I don't know your name, so
Okay.
What message would you give to people who are second or third generation immigrants who don't know enough?
Oh, that's a nice question. I would say learn, like just learn, be active. I mean, there's, I don't want to sound, somebody asked me about Derrida yesterday, which was so interesting and difficult to deal with, but I think a commitment, this is a lot to ask of some people, but a commitment to a heightened sense before data. So I would say a commitment to criticality. This is going to sound very complicated, but just things aren't always as they seem, right? And I think there's the quote, immigrant narrative has been really, is a meta-narrative, not the immigrant narrative, the narrative of the immigrant, of immigration, of the virtues of this process, of this being an empty space, a terra nullius in every sense. That isn't totally true at all, right? So be alive before the meta-narrative, which means be active before it and look for the flaws in the story and dig always deeper, right? Foucault talked about archaeology. This is something everybody can do, you know, to look more deeply, interrogate more vigorously, and ask questions, you know, not only of themselves, not only of yourself. I mean, this is not a blame game in any sense, but to join in the process of critical interrogation. And it can be a gentle, I think, and very loving and liberating thing to ask these questions together. And not for reconciliation. We don't have to reconcile. We don't have to be great friends. We don't even have to be friends. It would be nice if we each had a very substantive and triangulated sense of things together. And we're unsettled by that together and uncomfortable together, right? We don't have to actually like it or like each other. But I think that, you know, this is part of a kind of a citizenship that would be quite lovely in terms of a new political order, I think.
wanted to ask about the status of the concept of sovereignty in your talk.
Yeah, thanks. I thought you were going to go after me on that.
Yeah, just like the invocation of Gagnawage sovereignty, and it seemed the sort of problematics of that being a particular Western or Eurocentric
Right.
genealogy.
Right.
And second of all, your talk seemed to be gesturing to the idea that Gagnawage sovereignty doesn't just interrupt the sovereignty of specifically the United States and Canada. The idea that it might interrupt the concept of sovereignty. So, is there something you could speak to that?
Well, you're doing a very deep reading. I hope that it does. I mean, that would be my hope, right? And that it can simultaneously flip onto the concept itself, trouble it enough so that we can get the hell away from it. You know, I'm not a big fan of sovereignty, and yet it's a language game I have to play, and that Indians in the States especially have to play, and is deeply vexed here, right? Who uses a language of sovereignty here? Quebec uses a language of sovereignty for their reasons, right? So we have stayed away, Gagnawage has stayed away from it actually. So I feel quite a certain degree of guilt empirically for using that term. But I do think the kind of aspirations that are being articulated do approximate to jurisdiction, you know, all this, the sovereignty package. But I would hope that through the ethnography and through some of the argumentation, it can eventually be demolished. You know, because we can see that it is itself a constraint, and that that sovereignty is multiple, right? That we have this settler sovereignty. We need to you know, illuminate that and denaturalize it as well. So that's what I will say about it. It's more than gestural. It's deliberate. It is vexed. I'll have to write a paper eventually on it because it's just such a problem, right? It is in part the problem, along probably with capitalism, but we'll let Glenn take care of that one. Glenn Couthard and whoever else wants to go after that baby. Rita.
Thank you, Audra. I mean, Glenn Couthard seems very present in the room in some ways, right? Your practice of the empire or rage against empire.
Oh.
I love his talk. So I appreciate the talks that are building and connecting to one another. My question is, could you flesh out a little bit more the notion of the matrilineal aspects of your tradition in relation to this notion of persistent interruption, persistent disruption, persistent refusal? Like,
right.
what are it felt like there was something you were saying very specific about the role of gender in this process.
Right.
If you could flesh that out.
Yes, gender, and in particular, I think a heteronormative, heteropatriarchal sovereign. You know, this is tied to the project of settler sovereignty here, is this gendering of Indigenous conjugal life through the Indian Act, right? We talked about this in the class, in the seminar yesterday. Mark Rifkin has done a beautiful book, When Did Indians Become Straight? You must read the introduction. It's like 500 pages, but the introduction is really useful. Gender, race, sex, the heteropatriarchal project is embedded in the Indian Act, and it tries to cut Iroquois political order off at the knees so that we can't walk when it prescribes patrilineality, because women, I can't even, it's going to sound simplistic and it doesn't do justice to it. Women were in charge. There's no other way to put it. It was institutional, it was genealogical, it was very straightforward. And when that gets cut off with the Indian Act and patrilineality, and they become punished and exiled for marrying, quote, marrying out, all sorts of stuff is happening to Iroquois political order that is also cutting us off from each other, strangulating in different ways our form of nationhood. This becomes internalized by us and is inflecting this problem of membership today. So, and is deeply real to people. Like, there are people who really, so matrilineality is itself a fundamental interruption if it can persist, but it's not allowed to persist because of the Indian Act, right? Because this was deeply disconcerting to the OGs of settlement, right? The Dutch and the whoever was coming here to sign something, and the women, they have to meet with the women, right? They're like, why do we have to meet with the women? Well, because the women are making decisions, right? So this is something that was vexing and is still something I think that the sign or the symbol of this as women as the carriers of this political order is both aspired to, is both in place, and is also strangulated, right? So this is where matrilineal is potentially interruptive and yet can't be, in part because we won't let it be. Because there are some of us still within the community that say, well, you married out, you're gone. You know, so this is something that I write very carefully about, because and you should know, I spend a lot of time in the book also talking about like the scene of interpretation here is very unequal. It's not, Gagnawage in the 90s we were the Oka crisis, we were the criminals, the terrorists. I've written a paper on the ways in which we were, an article actually, it's in a law journal, like how we were represented as terrorists. We were the to say the least, the illiberal savages of Canada, right? So I do not pretend that there is an even ground of interpretation for the work that I did. So there's stuff that I just don't talk about, right? But I mean, one of the things I don't talk about is the ways in which, or I gesture towards it, I'm careful about it, the ways in which we've internalized ideas that are really, I think in some ways harmful, you know, and are not interruptive. Like this, you know, well, if you marry out, get out, go, you know, like punishing women, basically, right? And yet at the same time, there's the sense that that's wrong, you know, and that, so it's a site of deep complexity, which was not representable in the 90s, right? We were the bad guys, always the bad guys, right? Always the loudmouths, the Sopranos of the Indian world. I don't know, just, we were like the family in New Jersey that just, whatever, and that was erroneous. Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy.
That was amazing, Audra.
Oh, thanks.
I was wondering if you could say a little more about what you think about recognition.
Yes.
Because
yes.
It seemed to me I was hearing kind of two different
yes.
things being said. On the one hand, kind of a
real
discomfort with the language of recognition, right? You talk about refusal being beyond recognition.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, other things you said could be read as a demand for recognition.
Yes, certainly.
And so I wonder if you could just explore that a little bit more.
Well, I can explore it a little bit more, and what I can say is, first of all, I think you're correct. I think there is, and you're very gentle in your comment. I mean, in some ways it is a contradiction within the argument. Like there isn't a pure refusal, outright refusal. There is, even in the demand for passports, there's also a demand for recognition. There's saying we will wait this out until you recognize us, right? So, but there's simultaneously I want to open up the space for refusal within that discussion of recognition, right? Because there's also something that is being refused there, right? Legitimacy, their legitimacy, somewhat. So I think it's a tension. Like I think it's a tension, and I don't think it can be either or at all times. But I want to open up space for this other technique, this other political technique or strategy that is generated from these grounded fields of these political life worlds, right? It doesn't always have to be see me as I ought to be seen, or in Taylor's terms, which is taken as an unproblematized universal, right? It can be I don't see you, right? Which would be, some would say, the Palestinian case right now, right? I don't see you, and that's a tough political course to take. I see shades of that in Iroquois, right? So I'm trying to open up a way, and it's imperfect still, but it better get through those reviewers. I gotta finish this damn book.
It's actually building very much on the last question as well, so thank you very much for your talk. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in there.
Okay.
One of the things that stood out for me, and I guess it's sort of following from this sort of question of refusal, is about talking about the kind of pathologization of Indigenous people.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, like, from kind of your perspective and in the way that you framed it, if you think political refusal and kind of the way that you talked about it
right.
is depathologizing? And
Is depathologizing?
is it? And if it isn't, what would you say in terms of your own kind of stuff, like related to Gagnawage and Mohawk, like what would constitute actions that would contribute to depathologizing that kind of internalized colonialism?
What would contribute to actions is everybody just needs to be smarter, first of all. Like, it ties to this question about what can an immigrant do, or what can, I think if this would not be a surprise, refusals would not be necessary. We wouldn't need these surprises. We wouldn't need these blockades. We wouldn't need, to sort of have these productive impasses if people understood, I think, history in a deeper way, and the history of settler colonialism, right? The C-31 as this, what it was, what it is, where it comes from, a deeper understanding of gender and sexuality and its ties to whiteness, right? And had explicit discussions about this. Then I think there wouldn't be pathology anymore, right? It would be like, oh, I get this technique, it makes sense in light of what these people have just been through, right? There would be a kind of not decentering, that's lost its meaning, but like a kind of destabilization of the certainty that obtains to settler nationhood, right? This is very profound for the states. So for example, in the states, I stayed very quiet because I just didn't have the energy to argue this with this election with Obama. We don't vote, and we're not going to vote. You can make an Iroquois person vote, right? So don't even try it. And yet every Indian and their mother was like, you gotta vote, Obama's our man, da 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 da. And there's a sense of this as being treachery if you didn't vote. You were harming everybody else if you did not vote because this was so close. So I think this is a way in which a refusal is going to be chronically misread, even by people who should know better, right? We were these Navajos and the big, they love voting. They think they're Democrats and they love it, and it really means something to them. And I don't want to ruin their party, but it's, democracies, we taught them that, like, it's the Americans. And it's just, it seems like it's really playing into a larger fiction to me in some ways, but I'm very quiet about it, because I don't want to be always the one peeing in the coffee, but it really, it's, the refusal can't be understood, right? Because I don't think there is that critical genealogical understanding that even I would think Indians would have or Native people would have. Radical queers get it, because radical queers, the really radical ones, are like, we don't want to get married. We don't want the marriage thing because we don't want to be like hetero people, right? And we're kind of like, also like, we have our own thing going on, But then the recognition thing comes in, as Jeremy has flagged for me, and as I know in my own work, its attention, because not only is it this idea of it's a basic human need, but there really is the issue of, healthcare, right? And this sort of, here I'm thinking back to the queer cases where they're talking about, oh, my partner couldn't come when I was on my deathbed, and da-da-da, and well, that just ain't right, So there should be a recognition, right, of that form of affection and romance. So there is a tension. There is it's not irresolvable, but it is a tension, and I don't pretend to know a way out, right? I'm modest before it. So.
On the left here, Audra.
Yep. Right. It's relational. I really think it's relational. I think this is part of what is going on. And I have a chapter in the book that deals with something I call feeling citizenships, which liberals would say are intra-community modes of recognition that are outside of the regime of official recognition. But to me, it's when people in the community figure each other out and recognize each other outside of whether or not the person has legal status. But I think that is it's a relational register. It's not this existential statement of I'm 50%. It's I'm this person's son or daughter, or this is how I am to you. So it's a relational configuration rather than this quantified one. And that's not to say that quantum doesn't matter to some people very deeply, but I think there's something else going on that's far more profound and is difficult to operationalize. And that's why we have these struggles in the community over membership. And we're very open about it. And we get, you know, yeah, which is part of the pathologizing also.
You wondered if there were anthropologists in the room. There's a few of us. We met in Columbia, Hannah.
Oh, hi. Yes, 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 yes.
I enjoyed your talk. I just wanted to know a little bit more about the reception of your book. You're talking about the fact that you're in second review. So, operating within anthropology, is your book published in an anthropology series, and are you getting kind of pushback, or what are the sources of the kinds of revision process that you're going through with the book?
My book has taken me, I think it's 8 years now it's fully finished, right? Like I mean, I'm going through this second process, and I've had great reviews my first round, and I sat on it for a long time because I needed to think and read and reconceptualize, and I did. I didn't have to reconceptualize, but I did. I wanted to, and it's out again, and I got great reviews for my first round. But I changed it because my thinking changed, and I deepened the analysis. And anthropologists, for the most part, the ones I roll with, I teach at Columbia, so I have that's a different anthropological universe. We are theorized ethnographers. We are critical. Yes, it's the house that Boaz built, but it's a different space. You've been there. We do combat all the time. And we are considered in anthropology a unique department. We have political theorists that are on faculty there. So now, were I other anthropologists? So that's just to say, so I'm in that space. But there are people who hate me and hate what I do and hate my work. And those are people in Iroquois studies, the old guard. And I dislike them too. So it's fair. I have a whole chapter on them.
Lots of reasons to buy this book.
But I get along great. I mean, critical, as long as you're critical, we're great. We're going to get along. We're going to talk. We have lots to talk about. But it's the ones that try to tell me who we are and do this weird authentication thing and pathologize us. And, you know, we part ways. And we have a good fight once a year someplace in public. And it's mutual. It's mutual recognition, mutual enmity. No problem with that.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I really appreciate your sense of sarcasm and humor. I think it really makes lectures so much more engaging.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you about your phrase, kind of the knowledge archive of the membership process.
Yes.
Within your community, because I really love that idea of the knowledge archive.
Yes.
And like any archive, whether or not it's sort of a tangible or an intangible space, there's always those politics of inclusion and exclusion in those spaces.
Right.
And I know you've given a few examples of kind of your own sort of ethnographic research within your community, and you touched a little bit also on the gender issue that came up. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those politics and what came out of that in your research that you were doing, and maybe some examples of the research you did within your community.
On membership, I interviewed people and asked them, for example, I interviewed, did participant observation for years, and then I had very specified interviews where I sat down with people and I said, I never said, who is Mohawk? And this is methodologically part of your question. I didn't want to ask, who is Mohawk? I asked, what is a Mohawk to you? What are the attributes of being Mohawk? What are the qualities? How do you understand us? Where do you want us to be in the future? These were very directed and yet opened up spaces for an aspirational discourse. And it was because of that, and in particular because of one very important interview I did with somebody who just wouldn't tell me certain things, that I realized that there was so much more going on there than what was apparent in terms of recognition. It's very easy to go down And it's important, actually. There's important work being done, in particular by Native women scholars in Canada on this, and have been for the past 10 years. Very easy to go down the endless road of exclusion, right? Absolutely critical, also easy. What's less easy, and what I found challenging and important and productive, were people who were juridically excluded and yet affectively very included. That were still home working, going to school, living in Gagnawage, not going to leave Gagnawage, were theorizing their condition, and simultaneously refusing to talk to me about their exclusion. I thought, this is some really important shit, right? And I got to get to it. And that to me opened up this idea of a feeling citizenship rather than a juridic one, and was simultaneously, I thought, a pushback in some ways on recognition, right? Formal recognition. And just opened things up for me to think about the ways in which we actually were loving each other, caring for each other, and recognizing each other in a different way. And that's this notion of, I am this to you in this way, and is part of the endless talk that we do about each other, and not about each other in a bad way, but like, who's this person, da 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 da, and then it's like a mattering map emerges, right? So like, it's like a different genealogical configuration comes out through words. So, and that's not something that is captured by state logics, right? Or even governance. And that's what we're struggling with there, is like, how do we govern justly? How do we make this work? And we keep coming to impasses, right? Because it's so hard to operationalize this archive, right? Which is alive, right? And that's why I couldn't figure out that white guy, or whatever he was in Brooklyn. I just couldn't place him. I even asked other people, and they were like, he's full of shit, right? But maybe he's not. You know, this is the thing, is maybe he's not. Maybe settler colonialism was all about, eliminating. Maybe he is not eliminated, right? So it's interesting to me to think about him now. It took me years to get to that point. Yep.
Any final questions or comments? No. Okay. Well, Audra, I just want to thank you on a number of different levels. First, as the director of IGOV, thank you for adding brilliantly to our speaker series. As a couple of people said, you were a brilliant talk, excellent. I mean, couldn't have asked for more from you as a speaker here tonight. Secondly, as a Gagnawage owner, someone who grew up there, lived there for 32 years, still connected, still have a little bit of an accent from Gagnawage. Thank you for helping me understand myself better than I ever understood. I mean, people growing up in the community don't have a chance to reflect on these things in many Native communities. You don't have a chance to kind of see yourself through these lenses.
Yeah.
And it answers a lot of questions. And I think sitting here tonight was
so great.
A different experience for me. Writing about it is differently.
Yeah.
Being the one to analyze is different than sitting here hearing someone in such an articulate way explain yourself. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
As someone who was working in membership,
yes,
and drafted the first version of that membership code,
yes,
and did it for 8 years and understands these issues really well.
Yes.
Thank you for taking it further.
Okay.
And for getting it right.
Oh.
And I think that your book is going to make a really profound contribution, not only to the field, but in Gagnawage.
I hope so.
And helping things get better.
I hope so.
Gagnawage. So
thank you.
Now go on.
Yo. Thank you.